My pleasure is to introduce Fernando Brunel and Tomás Balparda from BBOA, that's Brunel Balparda Architecture Office from Rosario, Argentina. The partnership established in 2012, I think pretty much straight after their graduation. Short after that, their practice has won more than 5 first prizes in architecture competitions, and more recently, other awards for their work have started coming in 2021. They've been invited to Latin American Architecture Biennale in Pamplona, Spain. We've learned about their work mid this year through publication of 2 of their projects, which went viral in architectural websites. The first one, Madison Building, which effectively is 7 detached homes in Fisherton, a suburb of Rosario, was dealing with increasing density of development in a lot where previously we would find a single home. There was now 7 buildings being built. And shortly after that, we learned about their slightly older project that was completed in 2015, and that's social housing in Granadero by Baigorria, the project that we will be talking about today. Over to you, guys.
Well, thanks, George, and everyone. Our English is a little bit rusty, so to make ourselves more clear, we decided to prepare a little speech, and in order to fit it, the whole thing in 15 minutes. So first of all, we would like to thank the School of Melbourne for inviting us to give this lecture and to show our work. Even though this is not the first time we show our work abroad, it is our first contact whatsoever with Australia. So naturally, we are really excited about having this experience, and we really hope there's a next time to do this face-to-face. I am Tomás, and my associate Fernando. Our office is BBOA, Balparda, Brunel, Oficina de Arquitectura. We used to be fellow student mates at university, and after getting our degree, we opened our practice in 2012. As George said, 1 year after that, we were hired to develop the following project we are going to give this lecture about. It is a social housing development located in Granadero, Baigorria, a small town close to Rosario, the 3rd most populated city of Argentina. To begin with, we consider it important to contextualize the circumstances behind this design challenge. For many years in Argentina, the possibility of obtaining mortgage loans was restricted, and in 2012, the creation of a trust fund called Procrear gave the possibility of access to housing through a loan with a term of 30 or 40 years. Procrear was an initiative that the national government promoted for the delivery of 100,000 mortgage loans to acquire dwellings that were built by the program through urban developments. The program worked through national competitions, where construction companies, in order to participate, had to make not only an economic offer, but also a design proposal in each urban development. We were hired by a construction company to accomplish a proposal that, on the one hand, would be appealing for national judges, but on the other hand, had to be affordable enough for them to make a competitive offer. In other words, as architects, we were in between government expectations of forward-thinking designs and the company's economic efficiency philosophy. Even though designing with a limited budget represented a challenge, the rules of this national contest were a major obstacle. The brief program designed basic sketches that defined a footprint that was not allowed to change. As designers, the possibility of proposing changes was not really clear, and we had to respect the amount of typologies, the units, the square meters, the amount of services such as bathroom and kitchens, and well, all these matters were mandatory. The Baigorria project consists of 120 units split into 7 buildings. From the beginning of the designing process, the limitations became the strength of the new proposal. and only justified variations were the ones that prevailed. Empty space became the main strategy of intervention. This operation was not necessarily more expensive, but would improve lots of variables taken into account in the design of each building. Perforation to the volumes would not only improve the space quality of the buildings, but also its relationship with the street. In a country such as Argentina, security considerations are always taken into account in the design process. In this case, by increasing the amount of entrances to the building compared to the brief base, the relationship with the street improved, as well as the neighborhood's security. And while these features allow residents to establish control over their private and community property and ultimately deter criminal activity. The whole project is divided into 3 families of buildings. This includes ground floor plus 3-story building, ground floor plus 2 levels, and ground floor plus 7 levels. Each building was originally defined schematically in the brief base. Problems were identified in each building provided by the brief, but overcoming these mistakes became the starting point of our design proposal. In the lower buildings, the ground plus 3 floor and plus 2 floor buildings were identified. We identified the circulation as extremely inefficient. The distance from the main entrance to each unit for us was unacceptable. In addition, the whole volume was combined with one duplex unit on top of another one. This composition represented a contradiction because we were supposed to give a building with a diversity of dwellings. So in other words, the original conformation of the volume was the result of the repetition of the same unit. Towards this fact, we considered that the diversity of apartments was something essential. We considered to provide the future inhabitants a sense of belonging, and that it was a factor in promoting individualism.
This problem was an ambitious one to overcome, because every unit was supposed to have the same square meters and facilities. Facing this challenge, we arrived at the conclusion that by adding empty space, volumes, different units with the same square meters could be added, and the rest of this operation would be completed with the circulations. This operation added a cross duplex as an alternative. Another variation possible in distribution was locating bedrooms sometimes on top and sometimes at entrance levels. This way, the proposal manages to develop 8 different units, compared to the only one given by the brief base. Another design strategy was to pay special attention in the circulation stages. Open space was carefully thought out, and it gradually changes its scale along the way through the complex. A private exterior space was also provided in every unit. In addition to this strategy, rational solutions were proposed in order to make the construction process more efficient. Every decision made was thought out to be an affordable solution. An example of this is the use of the same frame window for the whole intervention, as well as a module structure. The open circulation was thought out to work as a common exterior space, where neighbors were expected to socialize and to appropriate for their own personal use. We believe that this kind of space makes the building breathe and provide an extra exterior space for the unit, which is essentially small in terms of square meters. Modifying the distance between the buildings was not allowed, but the perforations where the circulations take place make the central garden healthier in terms of illumination and ventilation and contact with the streets. Cross ventilation was also taken into account in the proper design of each unit. Each and every unit has it. As Tomás said, kitchen and bathrooms are also the same in every unit, also to make construction affordable. All of these designing decisions had a great impact on reducing costs. Moreover, the whole building is completed by the repetition of the first 4 modules. This also made the development of the technical and executive plans more efficient. Finally, the ground plus 7 floor building original volume is wide and not high enough. So the plan is broken and shifted in order to improve the perspectives. The main challenge was to work this typology, embracing some of the solution provided in the other typologies, in the lower ones. In this case, the empty space was also added and placed in every floor of the circulation. This action improved the common space that generally lacks natural lights and sights. The position of the balconies in each dwelling were also switched in between floors to provide a wider range of typologies. So we added different types of typologies, not only in the lower buildings, but also in the ground plus 7 ones. Ultimately, our intention was to express an architecture which not only favored inhabitants, but also the citizens in the offering of possible urban scenarios, understanding their own residential project as the building of urban landscape. For us, every obstacle, problem, and difficulty faced in the designing process has always been enriching. The idea behind every building has always appeared by trying to fix an apparent problem. Our architecture is proposed in order to improve not only living conditions in this kind of complex, but also to provide positive solutions to urban landscape surroundings. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for the presentation. That was amazing, and it's an amazing project. Congratulations for that, and we're really privileged to have you with us in this seminar. We've agreed to 1 or 2 questions after this, and I'd like to start with addressing the topic of individual and personal when it comes to designing for collective housing. So you were given the brief to design 105 or so individual units in a very close proximity to each other. And you know, when we're reading about a project, the topic that comes out is that you wanted to address individuality in that. Maybe it would be good to hear a couple of more sentences of how do you address that in terms of design, and what can designer do to put more importance on individuality of residential spaces?
Well, thanks, Djordje. You know, that's something that, as this was one of the first projects we came through as an office, everything that we learned from this experience, we carried on investigating about, and lots of housing projects came after this one. And this particular thing of searching for individualism, where the repetition of dwellings is something common in this kind of project, it is something really interesting for us, where in this case in particular, we also had like the restrictions of not being able to change the square meters, or the bathrooms and kitchen had to be exactly the same. So we managed to change. When we found out that maybe changing positions in the duplex kind of unit, where the bedroom on top, or sometimes on the entrance level, or maybe the relationship of orientation, where sometimes they face north or south or west or something like that. These small changes, we realized that make one dwelling different than the other one, and we also came up to the people that now are living there, and they really appreciate like having these small differences. You know, like maybe a couple of weeks ago we went there showing the project to other architects, and we came up with a woman that was living there, and she was like really proud about living in a special kind of cross duplex with and her bedrooms were on the ground level, and she was like really proud about her house being different to one her neighbor was having. So after learning this, and this is something that we always try to search in. You mentioned another project we didn't show here, that it's about the seven houses that are shared in one same project. And in that case, the search for these little differences are really shown in just the position of the houses, because they are, in terms of square meters, exactly the same, but just switching a little bit the position towards the orientation makes them like really special and particular, you know, compared to the rest. I don't know, like, what do you think about?
Yes, the thing is, in this particular project in Granadero Baigorria social housing complex, is that the amount of square meters that was going to be built in that portion of city were almost like tripling or quadrupling the amount of square meters building in the surroundings. So what we understood is that our surroundings were made like the natural way of the city growth is more irregular, with differences, with alternatives, because each family builds their own house in a different way, or with different architects, or with different intentions, or with different budgets. So we thought that these alterations will not only, as Tommy said, will bring a more broad amount of dwellings in order to be able to adapt different kind of living situation if the family was like an older couple or a single person, like a healthier way to, you know, to promote urban growth. Another thing is that this social housing in the future, like in maybe 50 or 60 years, will be introduced into the market, because the mortgages would be already being paid. So each individual would be the owner and could be selling their unit. We thought that also having variations would let the market work in a more efficient way. And if you sold like 120 apartments with the same square footage and orientations and etc., etc.
Sorry about that, maybe a short one. There's also something about repetition, you know, like when you have to face like social housing, or maybe like this complex of multi-housing project. Repetition is like, we are always looking for this kind of trick where, when we have to face this multi-dwelling kind of project, is there a way to repeat without repeating? You know what I mean? Like, there's some little switches you can do to the exact same unit that makes it unique, and you can still use the action of repeating as the solution for this kind of projects. And this kind of search is something that we always are facing or looking forward.
Thanks. So here's another question. You already started talking about this, and that's how spaces are being used. So your office is, I think, nearby, so you get a chance to see the everyday life of the building and how people have colonized the shared spaces in between there. I think it's a really interesting approach. And you know, when we work with students, one of the first things we would tell them, you know, don't put spaces don't use spaces that you don't know what they are for. And you know, obviously, but you've done exactly the opposite thing, and it's kind of very good example of sort of ambiguous use of communal spaces. So I'm interested to know a little bit more how the spaces in the access spaces are being used. So in photos, we see that, you know, some people have brought out the items from their units. They put the coat hanger there, bicycles are there. Do they have any relevance in how people socialize as well? How buildings connect to outdoor spaces?
Yeah, about those voids. The project itself, it's explained around those voids, that not only are healthy entrances, but also like they have the scale for being entrance to a large complex. You know, it's not a small door in a facade. It's a large hole in a building that has almost 100 meters. These terraces that happen in different levels, as you said, were used in different ways depending on the family composition. In some spaces, you can see a lot of gardening. In another places, you can see a lot of bikes or children playing. Here in Argentina, it's also really common to have barbecues outdoors. So maybe they buy a barbecue between 2 or 3 houses, and they're sharing, like dividing the usage. Like maybe we use it on Friday, you would do it on Saturday, and the other one on Sunday. But the most interesting situation is that the place is really well maintained, because as that circulation space only feeds like 8 apartments, only 8 families use it. So each and every one of them know the other. So if anyone tries to trash the place or not take care of it, you know who might have been. So as we divided these circulations into smaller portions than the base, the use is more, the place is more taken care of. And with COVID happening, was like a fun fact. Like COVID did us a favor, because it was amazing to see how those terraces were used during this pandemic situation, and that were thought like a long time before.
Yeah, and you can totally have a community feeling, like watching what is going on with these spaces. And the funny thing as well is that it was also kind of a trick when we were like so constricted or having these tough limitations towards what we were supposed to change from this brief base. We were like struggling with these units that each apartment is really small in terms of square meters. So these voids were like a gray area towards the rules we were supposed to be playing with. So in other words, like the square meters of these places were the ones that were supposed to be corridors, you know. So as we grew these square meters, nobody is paying now for these spaces. Everyone that is living there, it's like a little extension that they share among other neighbors, but they are not really paying for these voids, you know. So that's where the trick came, and we as architects could give this to future users, you know.
Yes, and ultimately it makes like a better transition from the streets to your interior home. Like you go on like entering in a sort of storytelling, like from the outside of the street to your house, with different situations happening, that we think it's really healthy for this kind of complex.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just being conscious of the time that we have at our disposal. I'd love to hear more about it, and I hope we'll have some other opportunities. Thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George, and we are happy to see you as well.
I'm delighted to introduce Marc, who is a co-founder of frohn&rojas, architectural design and practice and research network located in different parts of the world. There are nodes in Berlin, Santiago, and Los Angeles. Interestingly, Marc worked for OMA and collaborated with Brunel. He taught at several different places, at Aachen, at SCI-Arc, and Royal College of Art in London. And he currently chairs architectural space and design at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Their practice is exhibited and published widely, but today we're going to be talking about a specific project, Wohnregal apartments and Ateliers in Berlin, completed in 2019. A project is specific for its use of precast concrete elements in a very clever way. And over to you, Marc.
Well, thanks for invitation. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy and delighted to present the project. Well, thank you for your introduction. As you mentioned, this is a project that we've been working on and that we've realized with my office afar. And I would start with the model photo. And this model photo shows the basic structure of the Wohnregal as a 6-story construction made of precast concrete elements. And this type of construction is usually used in warehouse or industrial warehouse construction. So basically, morphologically, what we could say is we have a stack of 6 warehouses as the overall structure. And that doesn't come as a coincidence, because I do think that what is critical about the project from my perspective is the fact that we're trying to address 2 aspects that characterize the Berlin housing market that seem at first glance irreconcilable. The first aspect is a dire need for more housing, which by definition leads to the need for fast and cheap provision thereof, construction, which in turn implies very likely also serial construction, precast elements, and so on. And on the other hand, we're also facing an ever-widening range of ideas of how we live, how we work, how we share or combine these 2 aspects and facets of life. And therefore, something that seems intuitively go against the idea of pre-construction or seriality, which is the idea of a variety of plans, and therefore seems to contradict pre-construction and the uniformity that it seems to imply. And this is exactly where that type of construction comes in, that we have appropriated from the range of, or from the world of industrial warehouses. So what you see here is an axonometry of 1 floor of the house. And you can see the key elements of it. It's columns, it's beams, and a few walls, but mainly also the so-called TT ceilings. And I'll get back to that because that's a critical part of the logic and the freedom that the project offers in that way. So the same floor here in an exploded way, which probably makes it easier to detect the individual elements, columns, again, beams, and in the center of the drawing, the so-called TT ceilings. I'll show you a couple of images of the construction process, as I do think they offer an idea of actually how it all comes together and what kind of freedoms the project and the way it is constructed offers at the end. So you see at the very beginning, you see the first elements that have arrived, where the site of the project is an inner city site in Berlin. So we're attaching the building, or we did attach the building on one side to an existing kind of block condition, the traditional kind of, let's say, urban morphology of the city. But as you'll see on later images, it does not traditionally close the block, but actually leaves it partially open. What you see here is like somewhere halfway through construction. As I mentioned before, it's a 6-story building. Each floor was built within 1 week in terms of the structure, excluding, let's say, the skin and the interior, the guts. But you see how these elements that I've introduced a couple of slides before come together and constitute the basic, let's say, shelf as the Wohnregal, meaning the housing shelf. So like what we're looking at, how these elements actually constitute that major shelf. Here you see like how they come together. And as I mentioned before, these are these are elements, and this is a construction methodology that's commonly used in industrial construction. The tolerances are bigger, the seams are wider. This is not as you would normally imagine, let's say, kind of architecturally, with a capital A, refined kind of structure. So there was a couple of aspects also of making it applicable to the idea of housing. I think this image is critical to introduce the idea of the freedom that this shelving, this concrete prefab concrete shelving actually offers, because what comes to sight is the kind of relatively large span that these ceiling elements offer. I mean, you can get a sense here in the photograph of the thinness of the actual ceiling itself in the very front, but also the downstands that are implied in these T ceilings. And what is critical that there is no structure supporting these ceilings in the interior of the house. So they span from facade to facade. So that TT ceiling, or pi ceiling as it's called, is made up of a ceiling with two downstands, and those allow, for example, in the instance of the Wohnregal, to span for 12 meters roughly, something that is with traditional means of construction not economically feasible. But now that we're able to do that, suddenly we gain a humongous amount of architectural freedom and freedom in terms of plans on the inside, because we do not have to align floor plans of the different levels. So a photo from the factory where these pieces are being made. You know, it's somewhere in the more or less vicinity of Berlin, an hour and a half from here. Some of these factories in the past have been places where large parts of the prefabrication of East German housing elements have been delivered or produced, and they have been developing onward from that, and then focused on different types of pre-construction as the one that we're reappropriating now for housing. So, as I've mentioned, something that is very specific to the Wohnregal, and I think constitutes a critical aspect of that of the thinking behind it, is the aspect that we can offer while building in a prefabrication method, a large degree of freedom in terms of plans for these live-work ateliers that the building houses. So what you will see that on every floor there is a substantially different or completely different plan layout, therefore offering a wide range of ateliers or apartments somewhere between 35 square meters, you know, to 110 square meters. But before I show, let's say, before I show these individual differences from floor to floor, I also want to point out let's say, the organizational principles that stay the same on every floor. And those can be seen mostly on the very right of the plan, where you see the one bay of that structure, which is exterior. It contains the staircase, the lift, and two loggias as an external extension for each of the units. So you see one unit which is largely open, single, almost like a single space plan. Unit 1, Unit 2, solely divided by one core containing a bathroom. You see in a different floor one that separates bedrooms, a potential second bedroom or workspace. We have one where you have an uneven division of the floor with a very small or relatively small studio space where the sleeping area is just separated by a curtain, multiple bedrooms and workspaces in the other larger apartments, and yet one another of a separate division of a small open plan studio and a relatively large scale open live work atelier on that top half of the drawing. The basic orientation is an east-west orientation here, so that all units have proper daylighting. And here is, I think, like a drawing that is conceptually important for the project. It's an overlay, you know, it's an unfold of plan and a reflected ceiling plan on the top, but it's an overlay of all the different plans of the different floors. And so like that is something that is, I think, relatively unique to the project, as normally the rationale of building would not allow that for exactly that, you know, multitude of different plans being overlaid in that fashion. I'll continue with a couple of photos to give you an idea of how it appears in a build fashion. Here you see it. It is part of. It is set in Berlin Moabit, an inner city part of Berlin. It is a corner lot. It is obviously kind of taking the front of the block in a way, closing the corner. And you can see here on the right of it, that's like a series of these open loggias, and to the left you see the curtain wall of the interior. But what I mentioned before is that it does not completely close the block, visiting the site, you would see that it's a relatively heterogeneous area. It is one that has been destroyed hugely in the war. So much of the construction that you see in the immediate vicinity has been built in the last 70 years, roughly. So the idea of that pre-war Berlin block does not seem to make sense in my eyes. So like there is a certain openness, still keeping, you know, an immediate relationship to the street for the neighboring building. So we have not closed that off. But something that appears on this photo is also the importance of that curtain wall. The curtain wall constitutes, or is made up of sliding doors, you know, that you commonly know from, you know, single residential construction, single family home residential construction. They have full height in terms of each floor, and so what they allow is that you can like open on a large scale, open each of the ateliers of the flats. And so depending on the weather, you know, you can almost think of the interior in the summer and in the spring almost as a large open space, like almost like a loggia kind of interior where you feel the breathe. And keep in mind that that is very uncommon in Germany to have air conditioning in a residential environment. The northern facade of the building, as I pointed out when looking at the plan, houses the open staircase, these let's say balcony loggias for each of the flat, and the elevator. And with its complete openness, just like closed by a kind of stainless steel mesh, it also animates that street facade. So you see here the staircase being assembled in these precast concrete pieces. And going on the inside, the things that I've introduced in terms of the element that constitute the shelf, the concrete elements, the double T or the pi ceilings that you see here in terms of the downstands, the seams between the elements, they become visible. And you see also like a relative openness of the plan, I guess, in the upcoming photos. But what also becomes apparent as I focus on as I'll show a sequence of different apartments right now, that each one of them has a completely different plan, and as this one with the kitchen oriented towards the northern end of the apartment. And you see also the openness and that the curtain wall, the glazed curtain wall, offers. Obviously, the how would you say, this green element is an important part also, like in terms of the appearance of the building, the balustrade. I mean, the opening towards the balcony zone. You can see how the sliding window opens on a large scale. And one further look where you see also how in the finished building you see the concrete elements in the fashion that they join. And you see the large scale seams, and if you look at the concrete structure from within the flat, frontally, what you'll see is that through these large gaps, it almost appears as if these concrete pieces are floating, and it adds like a very strange architectural sense to something that intuitively weighs multiple tons, each one of them. So there is like a strange, curious kind of sensation that raises. What was apparent, or what is implied in a serial construction logic is not only, let's say, this idea of freedom within that building and the repetition of the structural elements, but it's also the repetition on a larger scale, the repetition of an approach that could be replicated on a different site in a different scale, because one should also consider working in this way requires a lot of, let's say, investment, not so much financially, but in terms of understanding the intricacies of a construction methodology of that sort. So it is an investment that almost demands that you think about it or think in terms of a replication. So shortly after, or almost before we fully finished the Wohnregal project, we were approached by a German developer, Euroboden, and so we got together in the context of one other project, which is just currently started construction. And the interesting aspect about it is at first glance also the setting. The setting is in one of these large 70s, 80s East German housing estates, and they have been known for having been completely prefabricated at the time. So ultimately, in a certain way, one could argue that we, with our building, are meeting our own architectural grandparents of sorts. But that being said, I think it is important to point out not only that that there's a historical lineage and there's a conceptual like circle closing, but at the same time, it's also critical to understand the huge conceptual difference between the historic idea of the prefabrication that from the 70s, 80s, because that form of prefabrication was built upon a series of wall elements that were stacked, and therefore the seriality would go hand in hand with the uniformity of plan. They were good floor plans, but they were a pure repetition of a few very limited options in terms of plans. So the skeleton construction that we're proposing, or that we're not only proposing, that we've realized and now in the process of realizing the second time, goes exactly the opposite way, as it combines the idea of seriality with that of a large degree of a, let's say, freedom in terms of different plans and models of living and working. So you see the actual site, you see what I just described, the surrounding being characterized by prefab housing from the, in this case, from the early 80s, large scale residential, let's say, areas that were completely constructed from scratch at that time due to the humongous shortage of housing that they were facing at the time. The building is characterized through these two opposing linear buildings that you see on the top and the bottom of this plan drawing. There's six-story, let's say, linear buildings surrounding a shared garden plateau with children's playground and other shared facilities. And the whole construction sits on top of, let's say, a mobility platform with parking, but also places for bicycles and so on. Here you see on the upper floors and the plan, and one of the critical aspects of it is, and that you see in this rendering, is that in front of the facades, there's not only the circulation, you know, the let's say a type of gallery kind of circulation to enter the flats, but there's also a series of balconies, individual balconies for each of the apartments, and through that wave-like layout, they allow for everybody to also, while being on the balcony, to actually visually be able to connect outside that housing complex, but to kind of look out this way or the opposing way out of it. So basically, as I mentioned before, this is a continuation in terms of developing the idea of the Wohnregal, or ideas, various ideas in terms of the flexibility, in terms of the construction method, and also all of these aspects that are implied in the Wohnregal, to develop them further on a different scale, in a different context. So this one has a little bit more than 120 units of varying scales, and again in a great variety, from two-story family-oriented units to very small scale for singles or people for live-work environments. So I do think it's, in my eyes, quite interesting to think of that not as a one-off in terms of architecture, but as an approach that can be developed further and that can operate in very vastly different, let's say, urban settings and on varying scales. Well, thank you. I will now close the screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks for the presentation and for amazing work. We have time for two quick questions. I thought maybe it would be great if we revisit the benefits of the system that you are proposing. So, you know, is it reducing cost? Is it minimizing waste? Or is it, you know, being faster in construction? You mentioned some of those things, but a quick recap maybe would be great to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is, I mean, the way of construction does reduce cost and time to a certain degree. Obviously, there's other costs in construction. There's property, you know, there's a cost of property, which at least in the Berlin context is a major aspect by now. So just looking at construction cost will not solve all of the housing issues that we're facing. So we should be honest with ourselves on that front. Nevertheless, I do think it is critical because, like, it makes us also a certain degree independent from let's say the seasonal conditions with cold winters, so that actually implies delays, concrete doesn't cure, all these kind of aspects. So we're getting to some degree independent from that, which is also a cost and risk reduction. We also are, because this is a skeleton kind of construction, we're reducing the materiality implied, or the mass implied, but it's like an environmental aspect that is important, I think. So there's a substantial reduction in terms of concrete being used. Also, what is important, and it's like another way we need to look at construction these days, is if we think about it in terms of urban mining, and in also, like, once a building goes beyond its lifespan, what it is also, there's the way the Wohnregal is being constructed, it allows a very clear separation of materials, which is the foundation for any sort of recycling or reusing or reappropriation of the material. So these aspects are also critical to the way the construction is thought through.
Okay. So just to clarify, elements that you're using, are they developed bespokely for this project, or you were able to recycle an industrialized system that already existed for other people?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So let's say what is standardized are the types of elements. There's columns, there is there's beams, there's TT ceilings. There's also standardized approaches of how they are joined. But actually, each piece is being produced in a bespoke way, because the reinforcement is being specified, you know, as per structural calculation for each piece. Let's say the length and the width and whatever, they can be adjusted, obviously within limits. But so to answer the question, these are bespoke pieces, but the principles are set within the casting system. And so what needs to be understood as you work with it is really what are your freedoms, what can be adjusted, you know, cheaply or without extra cost, and like where, and that's sometimes surprising, where suddenly kind of cost spirals out of control, because suddenly something that seems very simple geometrically in terms of production turns out to be an absolute hassle.
Okay, and then the final one, I mean, I could ask many more, but we really have to stop at some point, would be about the relationship between the architect yourself and the developer in this particular project. Was it the developer that was interested in using such system, or it came from the design side?
It came from the design side, and also for the Wohnregal project, we as architects are not completely separate. We're involved also with the development of the project, because it was critical for us, as we were seeing that housing was such an important aspect in the architectural production in Berlin or in Germany at this point in time. It was critical for us to kind of actually have a voice within that. And I do think the most productive way would be to show one way, and the showing would actually have to be something that does not exist in drawing only. So like to kind of demonstrate through the project that there is a way to think through it in such a way. So that is like an aspect that came from an architectural perspective, but at the same time, obviously, us being also involved in the development of the project.
Great, thanks very much. I'd love to continue the conversation, but we just have to stop because this is how much time we have. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ramon Bosch, who together with CAPDEFERRO is the founder of BOSCH.CAPDEFERRO Architects, an office based in Girona, Catalonia. Have won many prizes, have been exhibiting and publishing their work widely. For instance, in Venice Biennale in 2012, a year before that, they've earned an Emerging Architect Special Mention at Miss Granadero Award. They've also exhibited at Spanish Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism in 2018 and 2021, received awards as well. Today, we're going to be hearing from them about their project called 6x6 block in Girona, completed in 2020. Over to you, Ramon. I'll ask one or two questions at the end.
Okay. So thank you, Djordje, and thank you everybody for inviting and for the interest in our work. I would like to first talk about some generic aspects that are related to our work as architects, but specifically also about the 6x6 block. And I'll try to show 6 images. That's the reason of the title, the 6x6 block in 6 images, because we'll try to present 6 different topics related to the project. So the first image we have here is this amazing picture by William Tanner in the early 19th century. And we would like to show this image to talk about atmospheres in a way. Atmosphere, not only from the romantic point of view of this picture, of the romantic impression of the power of nature, but also related to the media in which we live. As architects, we remove solid matter to achieve the comfort conditions of this atmosphere, about this air, which is the living in which we move all our lives. Next slide is also a picture in the late 9th century by Ramon, a Catalan painter. And it's also related to atmosphere. This picture is also talking to us about atmosphere in the cultural sense and in the comfort sense, about the living conditions related to comfortable spaces, lights, shadows, temperatures, and close traditions, so on. So as architects, we think that we are especially keen on those two kind of atmospheres. The very scientific and objective one, the parametric data of the air in which we live, and also the quality of the spaces that we are supposed to design. The third image we wanted to show you is this image from the early 20th century by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, which is one of the first drawings that were somehow trying to explain how our neurologic behaving. So which are the mechanisms, which are the methods, which are the natural processes that allow us to understand things, and as architects, which are the methods that we should control to achieve these atmospheric conditions, both in the parametric sense and the cultural sense. The fourth image we wanted to show you is this image by Paulo Picasso that you might probably know, and it's now related to the design process. In these bull engraving paintings, Paulo Picasso went through a process of, we could say, simplification, distillation in a way, decantation, in which he was able to get rid of most of the lines and to understand which were the fundamental lines that could explain the bull itself, the whole animal, with the minimum material in a way. This decantation process is also something that as architects we use to achieve the simplest solution to solve a problem. While the next image that you will also probably know by Alberto Giacometti in mid-20th century is exactly the opposite. In architecture, sometimes one thing and the opposite are both true. And we would like to talk about the sedimentation. So this process is of accumulating lots of lines, lots of data, lots of different materials and topics that somehow enrich the process and are at the end embedded in the final solution. This kind of portrait in which by accumulating lines, trying to find the right one, it just the portrait just shows up, or it appears as a revelation of the most probable line after all the iterations. This is also something related to the uses of architecture. We give a single answer to a problem that afterwards should be also adaptable to new conditions. So many different things should happen in the same place at the same time. Finally, the sixth image of the 6x6 block that we would like to introduce is this contemporary artist that you will probably also know, which is Banksy. It's related to climate change, of course, and to our responsibility as architects related to the carbon footprint of our activity. Next slide, please. We can show these six images as the six topics that are somehow related to our work as architects, and especially in the 6x6 block, which are atmosphere in the let's say physical or scientific point of view, the cultural atmosphere of the spaces we make, our control as architects of these methods that allow us to achieve these particular conditions, simplification as a design process, accumulation of that, and finally this consciousness about our role in our duty to bring solutions to the climate change and to reduce the carbon footprint of our buildings. So, talking about the precise exercise of the 6x6 block, it is a dwelling block situated in Girona. Here you can see this sort of photo of Girona. The block is the orange point, the orange shade here, which is somehow in between in the urban area, in between Sal, which is this urban grid in the left-hand side of the image, and Girona city, which is the one on the right, in a particular place where both urban grids meet. And in next slide we can see how this dense grid of both cities are somehow evolving into an open block area, plenty of public equipments like schools, hospitals, and so on. This is the site plan, somehow the roof plan, where we can see that it's a compact block due to urban regulations, approximately 40 meters long by 15 meters depth, with a very particular condition, which is facing south. This you can see here the orientation. We could design a central core of vertical communications with staircase and lifts, elevators that could give access to 3 different blocks of apartments on both sides, right and hand side, with cross ventilation, all of them facing south and facing north. This is just the basement floor plan with a parking lot made out of concrete. And in next slide, we can see how the floor plan provides for access for vehicles in the right-hand side, which is the street, and pedestrian access from the north. An important thing about this site is that we have, of course, a great boiler, which is the sun. It's a nuclear boiler, in fact, facing south in the long facade of the building, and a green public area in the north, which can provide for some natural breath, a natural presence in the middle of the urban grid, and a natural access for pedestrians. So we have somehow a nice surroundings despite being in the center of the city. In next slide, this is the floor, ground floor plan, but in the next slide we can see the typical floor plan that explains the central core of vertical communications and 2 different blocks of apartments that have cross ventilations and 2 different orientations facing south and facing north, ground floor and 5 floors above that, so 6 stories of 6 apartments. That's the 6x6, 6x6 name. That's the reason of it. And a very important question, we wanted to, as I said before, reduce the carbon footprint of the operation. That's why we decided to act in 2 different directions. The first part is to somehow reduce the energy embedded in the construction process itself. That's why we decided to use CLT wood panels, timber panels, to build the whole structure of the building. And on the other hand, we try to reduce the energy demand that we need to achieve the thermal comfort conditions for the interior spaces. Taking into consideration that we wanted to design a structure that itself was able to configure the spaces, and that we had a fantastic south orientation here in the north hemisphere. As you know, we have the sun in the south orientation. We tried to design some passive strategies that could allow us to achieve the comfort conditions with no extra energy demand needed. That's why all these apartments have this cross ventilation and an important facade facing south, so facing the sun, which will be our boiler, as you will see. And just by changing the air in different seasons in different parts of the building, we achieve the comfort conditions with no extra fuel, let's say. That means that the south facade that you can see here is very important. It will act as a sun space, as a greenhouse in wintertime, and as a shaded terrace in summertime, which is the most important strategy that we used. And we can see it in next slide, that the cross-section of each one of the units of the apartments, how the performance work either in wintertime or in summertime. This is the wintertime position. We have a central core of kitchens and bathrooms, and 4 different generic, let's say, rooms configured by the timber panels as load-bearing walls, and a south facade with this sun space that has a double enclosing of glass. That allows us to naturally increase the temperature of this intermediate space, of this thick threshold, from 10 to 15 degrees. It means that this red air that you can see in this drawing is from 10 to 15 degrees higher than the outdoor air. And just by introducing this air, this inlet system of air from this naturally preheated air, which is the thermal conditions in the interior spaces. And in the next slide, we can see which is the performance in summertime. This heat recovery unit that is in the central core of the bathrooms changes the position, and the inlet air, instead of being taken from the south facade, is taken from the north facade, so fresh air that's introduced in the interior spaces, and we achieve these thermal conditions. In this position, in this summer season position, the gallery in the south facade is changed, is configured as a shaded terrace with some traditional wooden shades that you will see in an open position. So this passive strategy based on preheating or pre-cooling the interior generic spaces by introducing the air from these thresholds both on north facade in the summertime or on the south facade in the wintertime, built with CLT, should allow us to reduce in an important way our carbon footprint, in the sense that we are reducing the energy embedded in the construction. As you know, timber can fix CO2. Due to the photosynthesis, the trees are absorbing carbon dioxide and transforming it into wood and into oxygen. So until we burn somehow this approximately 1,000 tons of wood that we have in the building, we have 1,000 tons of CO2 fixed in that place. And the energy demand is reduced through these passive strategies that, of course, are supplemented by the natural cross ventilation of the both opposite facades. So one of the key things of this system was to design these galleries as a sun space in wintertime and a shaded terrace in summertime. And here it comes to light another thing that is important for us, and is related to this 6x6 block. On somehow we could say that this exercise, the design of the 6x6 block, tries to get to points between what is apparently some dichotomies related to how can we increase density in our cities and at the same time be sustainable somehow. How can we build what we can consider a prototype, at the same time be link it, intertwined with the history and the traditions of the site, or how we deal with these very scientific and parametric aspects of the project, and how we provide with comfortable spiritual spaces. I explain this because this image explains somehow the origin of this, the design of these galleries. Girona is a city by a river, as you could see in the auto photo in the beginning, with some typical houses which are the postcard of the city, hanging over the city wall, that are represented in these galleries of this picture. In the next slide, we can see how those galleries were somehow in our mind when we designed these shaded spaces or these sun spaces, following the patterns of the history of all these layers of the galleries, typical galleries of the site. And in the next slide, we can see how with local enterprises we were able to produce some mock-ups and to evolve these solutions to contemporary solutions. Like in next slide, where we can see how all these patterns were afterwards somehow in the final design of the building as contemporary galleries, a new building, but with old somehow patterns and styles. In next slide, we can see at the end which is each one of the units. As you could see, we somehow bet for flexibility. We think that flexibility is very important in our buildings, especially in residential buildings. And that means flexibility to the exterior and to the interior. We could see how the building itself, by its skin, is changing and adapting to different seasonal or climatic conditions, but again, in the interior, we would like to give a generic structure with generic rooms able to host whatever related to dwelling or other uses. And that means flexibility during time. So those spaces should be able to be configured in different ways. So the shifting needs of the inhabitants shouldn't be a problem to be incorporated in the same design. Here we have the apartment units empty with the central core of bathroom and kitchen. The access to these corridors in the north facade and the galleries in the south facade on the right-hand side, and how these 4 generic rooms in both facades are ready to be communicated with these sliding door systems or spared apart, and that allows for different configurations. For example, in the next slide, we can see the same apartment configured with a 1-bedroom program with access to this dining and kitchen and living, so somehow the day zone and the night area on the top. But again, in next slide, we can see how it can be configured in 2-bedroom units with no needs of more works, just by using with furniture in different ways the same spaces configured by the CLT load-bearing walls. Next slide, we can see the same apartment with the 3-bedroom configuration. Or, for example, not only hosting the domesticity, but also hosting the extraordinary. So how in these relatively small apartments of 70 square meters, you can even have a celebration or a dinner celebration for 30 people just by moving the sofa for a while, or other extraordinary uses like this slot car racing championship. Beside the joke of the slot race championship, this picture allows us to understand how the number of doors, so communication in between rooms, is allowing for more flexibility. And that means that each one of those rooms has at least 3 different connections with the rooms beside it. Or other extraordinary uses like this pop-up pastry dinner, where you have the intimate spaces in the south facade, and the north facade can be open in weekend, for example, to share with the community or the rest of the people of the block or the city as a pastry atelier or other activities, while keeping the intimacy in the south facade. Or, for example, trying to use the same spaces, generic spaces, for collective uses. So apart from the dwelling units in the block, the inhabitants of this building can share communal spaces with different uses in each one, in any one of the units. For example, a nursery or a kindergarten in one of the units, or, for example, other collective uses like a canteen with 40 people to eat in the space with the kitchen, or other collective uses like co-working spaces, or it is one in the next slide, like a gym ready to be used for the inhabitants of the block. So this interior flexibility to achieve hybrid uses in the same building with just one same answer. We can see this Picasso strategy of simplification, of decantation, that brings him to the point where only with one line he can draw the figure of a woman dancing, which is somehow what we can see in the next slide, what we try to do with the building, trying to find the less elements to achieve the most complete performance, so the less lines to achieve the most complete building we can. Well, on the other hand, the Giacometti sedimentation process is somehow achieved. The next slide, we can see that the accumulation of lines somehow allows for the figure to appear, to bring back to light. Like us in our building, all the superimposition of new uses are bringing this complexity to this simplification that we previously designed as a structure. So both strategy, sedimentation and decantation as processes to achieve the most simple structure for the major number of uses possible. So simplifications allow for complexity. Here we can see the building under construction, this big cabinet made out of timber with a grid of load-bearing walls and bracing walls that configure the spaces, generic spaces themselves. So all the image of the structure is the addition of cells that configure both the structure and the spaces. and somehow all the benefits of industrialized buildings that also allow us to pre-dimension and prefab all the holes, and the surveys go through in factories, so no needs of holes on site. All these enfilade of spaces from north to south, the north corridor access facing the green area, and this is the finished building. Again, the green area, public area, and the street, and somehow the street that goes above along the building to bring access to all the units in the north facade. A very transparent and permeable facade from the building to the exterior, while quite an intimate facade going through with some reverberations of the neighborhood. The access from the public area, and the south facade as the quid of everything, this skin that somehow is expressing what's visible but also what's invisible, so the season, the movement of air, and the temperature, the thermodynamics of the behaving of the building itself. This facade that can be configured as a sun space, as you can see here with this glassed facade, or this glazed facade, or as a shaded terrace with these persianas, these wooden typical traditional shades. So here we can see what should be the configuration in wintertime as a sun space, preheating the air, and as a summer space during summer as a shaded terrace. And here we can see a slide where we can compare both conditions of the same facade in wintertime or in summertime. Finally, the access from the north corridor with this timber appearing back as this warm tiles that receives you at the entrance of each one of the units, with these transition threshold spaces that allows you afterwards to access to the whole depth of the building, and these sliding door systems that allows you to both communicate or spare apart the different spaces of the rooms of each one of the units. Again, in this long section, you can see how both spans can be connected or separated with this system of wooden panels, or how this enfilade of rooms allow you to get to these thresholds, both in north facade as a working space, inhabitable thresholds, or in the south facade as a shaded space in summer, or as a preheated sun space in wintertime. Finally, just to show the flexibility of these spaces, 3 slides of the same space configured with different uses depending on how you distribute furniture, as a working space, for example, or as a play space or studio, or finally as a dining room at the entrance of the house, or in the south span, how you can use the same room of approximately 12 square meters as a workspace, or as a sleeping room facing the gallery, the sun space, or as a living room. So this is more or less what we tried to achieve with the 6x6 block experience, and wanted to share with you, and ready to answer your questions in case you have some. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ramon. That was a really good presentation and a really amazing work, amazing project. If you let me ask 1 or 2 questions, although I want to ask 6, but I will stick with 1 or 2. It's about CLT that I'm interested the most. We all have very high hopes for CLT because it's good for the environment. Although concrete is still predominant, it's possibly a lot easier to build in concrete, and therefore we use it a lot. But when it comes to CLT, you know, environmental benefits are first. But what I really like about your project is that it lends itself to the very architecture expression itself, in a sense that you see the texture of the material in the interior of the flats, and you also use structural elements to define the project, to define even the flexibility of spaces through thinking about CLT. So my question for you would be, from the first-hand experience of using that building material, what would you share with fellow designers about it?
Well, I would say this is something I didn't explain because it would be too long, but we had another design for the same building with prefab concrete elements before, that we somehow, it's not a translation, but that we think of the whole design with CLT. That's to answer your question. You cannot build the same thing with different materials. To achieve a real efficiency in construction, I think that each material brings somehow the techniques and the final space is embedded. That means CLT as a structure can be used both for floors, of course, but also for walls. When you're designing domestic spaces in between load-bearing walls, this already gives you a sense of the dimensions in between supports, right? So I would say that a natural use of CLT would be domestic spans. Otherwise, if we want to achieve like longer or bigger spans, we should begin to use mixed structure. But for domestic spaces like dwelling, I think it's a perfect technique and a perfect material, since these rooms that we just saw are approximately 3 per 4 meters. So this allows for many domestic spaces to be hosted. The design quit is here just how you can link those spaces in between, and this is not a new thing. We are using very new technology to do very old things. The enfilade of rooms, or the housing as a collection of rooms in a sequence of rooms, is something really old, from old palaces till nowadays. So I would say CLT is a fantastic material for sustainable issues, but has its own rules, and the structure itself should define the project following the rules of the spans of the CLT panels.
They're incredibly thin, the CLT walls. Is it just a good engineer, or there is another trick to it?
Well, that's another nice question. All the vertical, so the walls, the load-bearing walls, are 12 centimeters thick. That would be approximately 5 to 6 inches, I think, in Anglo-Saxon. So 12 centimeters, while the floors are 15 centimeters. Those are not really thin. It could be even thinner, but that's a nice thing that you point out. If we go back to the images with the building under construction, you will see that, in fact, it's a very dense structure. So it's completely braced in both directions, so it's very rigid. And our intuition here in the studio is that if you use concrete or heavy materials, you can go to longer spans, and due to horizontal forces, you're still stable. While when you're using very light materials like timber, like CLT, you should provide with a very rigid structure that can only be achieved by geometry. So by the union in many directions of many elements. And that's also related to thermodynamics. Heavy structures allow for thermal mass, while these light materials like timber are dissipating energy. So we should provide with a very rigid structure made out of many different braced elements and achieve thermal mass with other elements of construction. In our case, it was the pavement afterwards added to the structure. So each material has its own rules and its consequences, both in terms of geometry and thermodynamics, I would say.
If I understood correctly, I think the frontage of each unit is 6 meters as well. So you have 2 rooms, 3 by 3 meters in width at the frontage of the building. So I think it's really remarkable how many variants of different layout you were able to achieve within the confined grid, and that is really maybe worth teasing out another sentence or two about spatial flexibility and different ways of using same footprint of the apartment, but very different organization inside.
Yeah, in fact, the grid that we showed, it's not, as I said, some of the walls are load-bearing walls, so structural, while the others are bracing, but the sliding walls in between rooms Those are not structural. It's you can see the wood, but it's not structural. So we could even achieve spaces of 6 meters span by in between load-bearing walls. I think this is the quid of the question, the dimension of the room, which is quite easy to design or to imagine in dwelling, because we all move in domestic spaces, and allow for quite generic uses. Well, as I said, if we need for program issues larger spans, it will get more difficult to do with timber, I guess.
Yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation, and I hope that we'll get the chance. But thank you very much. We have to stop because of the time that we have at our disposal. Thanks again for being with us and sharing your amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Lisa Garner and Andrei Wojtertil, who have formed a practice named Lian. It's a new and upcoming practice. And I think their main strength is the combination of international experience and local knowledge. International experience comes from Berlin and London. And they'll present their ongoing project produced for the Future Homes initiative, launched by Victoria State Government, including the Office of Victorian Government Architect, with an aim to inform potential planning reforms. The project specifically focuses on medium density housing and proposes a sustainable way to accommodate growing population in Melbourne and Australia in general. The initiative had 2 phases. Lian were the winners among the winners of the first phase, and now they are working on the second phase, which is related to implementation, and that is to deliver a project with, I believe, 12 new housing units. Over to you, Lisa and Andre.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, George.
So yes, we're Lian, and we've been working on the Future Homes initiative initially through taking part in the Future Homes competition, and subsequently through adapting our winning scheme for implementation. Briefly, the Future Homes initiative is a collaborative program set up by the OVGA and DELF, looking to incentivize the delivery of medium density infill housing in Melbourne's existing suburbs through the adaptation or development of template designs by a group of architects selected through the initial competition. And the goal is for the templates to be adapted to varying site conditions across the city, meeting high benchmarks for accessibility, sustainability, and financial viability to give them every chance of uptake. We'll be running through the competition design, free space, and one example of the design being adapted, in this case for public housing, by Homes Victoria. We began developing our design through the crystallization of a selection of core principles that we feel imbue the qualities of a single household home in the suburbs, for translation to apartment designs, hopefully maximising the appeal of medium density housing within the typical suburban Australian psyche. Firstly, we offer spatial generosity in the form of double height ceilings, providing a sense of escape that the suburbs offer and people don't think of with apartments. Secondly, we're locking in direct access from living spaces to 25 square metres of private open space, and as many of those private open spaces to be located on the ground floor if possible. Thirdly, ensuring dual aspect apartments for access to light and air, often with 2 points of entry to enhance the free sense of movement facilitated by detached houses in the suburbs. And then also providing shared space as part of public realm and street. So an incidental social space that is part of pedestrian and vehicle movement through the site. rather than space being programmed as such.
And so we started our design process by embedding these core objectives or principles that Andre has mentioned, and starting with the basic unit of a double height living space you can see on the left, that connects directly to an outdoor space, and that to be combined with any number of bedroom and bathroom units. And that essentially being the basis for creating from a studio up to a 4-bedroom unit. And then the next step was finding a way for those units to be combined and work together. So we've sort of came up with this unique kind of interlocking arrangement that allows for every 2 bays of this sort of structural grid to be interchanged with, say, a 2 and a 2-bedder, or a studio and a 4-bedder, or a 1 and a 3. And that was about finding a really flexible and adaptable kind of bones for the building that could enable different dwelling mixes for different demographics and for different briefs. Yeah, just embedding that sort of adaptive flexibility. And then that essentially forming a logic for a linear typology that can be extended or cut or rotated to suit any different site. Yeah. And then with that sort of adaptable logic, I guess the next steps were around identifying a key set of steps to make this proposal work on your typical suburban block. So we were specifically looking at blocks in the north-south orientation and the east-west orientation. And so defining kind of a series of moves to be implemented. So the first of those being obviously a consolidation of suburban blocks. The second being to reduce the footprint to the minimum and build to the maximum height of 3 stories. The third step being to maximize the orientation towards the north. So where possible, having these units facing north, just to maximize solar gain and thermal efficiency. And then fourth, being quite clear about the split of vegetated permeable surfaces and gardens consolidated to one side of the site, and the vehicle and access to the other side, and defining, sort of creating quite a clear distinction between those 2 access points. And then introducing a communal space through the thoroughfare through the access point to the building. As Andre mentioned, sort of an incidental space. And then splitting up that volume so that the living spaces are facing north and the bedrooms to the back, just having that dual facade condition. And then obviously those living spaces opening out onto that 25 square meters of private open space for everyone, either on the ground floor or for the top level units, to a generous rooftop sort of courtyard terrace. So this is the ground floor plan for our competition scheme in Braybrook. So you can see that the car parking is sort of in a very tight and compact parallel parking arrangement to the side of the site, just leaving the rest of the space free. And we sort of see that opportunity for that parallel parking to be used in other ways, and either sort of as a play space for children, or in the future, cars not being there, the opportunity for that to become a laneway or a sort of a throughway. Yeah. And yes, what we're showing here is the other side of the site, and that prioritization of sort of consolidated green space and deep soil that sort of given over to the private gardens. And then this sort of entryway communal arrangement of services along the side boundary that's kind of on the pedestrian's journey to their door, which is, if we go to the next slide, sort of being imagined as a series of functions that residents require in their daily life. So the communal laundry and the clothes hanging and the bike workshop and a productive garden, and just creating a moment for residents to pass by each other just while doing kind of daily functions. And shown in pink here is those double height living spaces where possible oriented to the north and where we couldn't oriented to the east, and how they directly open onto the private gardens, so that seamless connection that we spoke about in the beginning. And this is just showing to the north facing street interface for those dwellings, and trying to capture as well the kind of individuality of each resident, and so how that's how we've enabled that expression to come through with these pergolas and small intermediary elements, just for people to claim and make their own, and for that expression also to be facing onto the street, just sort of in the same way that the suburbs kind of are a format for people to express themselves through their front garden. This was about trying to make that possible, and sort of a townhouse terrace expression rather than sort of one big apartment. And moving inside, just showing that double height living space and just the abundance of natural light and the quality that that brings to the living space, but also the opportunity for that like blank canvas to be something that residents can animate, like hang a surfboard on the wall or bring really appropriate to make their own space, which is something we've felt is really important to instill even in apartment living. And looking in the other direction, sort of seeing the possibility for that mezzanine space to also be a working from home, and also kind of baked into the structure the possibility for that mezzanine to be built out in the future. It's just another layer of adaptability. And just looking at the first floor, so you can see the generous void spaces over the living space. And another really sort of central part tying the scheme together is the access to the building at the upper levels. So this bridge that we've conceptualized between the two buildings, we see as another really important element to bring residents together, just to make it a really beautiful space that is pulled away from the building for privacy, that creates this deep soil zone for vegetation to grow through and create more privacy, but also just to make it a really special entry to the back door. And on the top floor, obviously where the ground floor garden isn't possible, we've sort of chosen to create really special open to the sky terraces that are kind of enclosed as an outdoor room. And just showing that sort of type of space here where you have a really wide view into the horizon and a great outlook. And so it's sort of got a different quality to the ground floor double height typologies. And just showing the dwelling mix. So it was not only part of the brief, but really important to us to have the full spectrum of bedroom types, from a studio to a 4-bedder. And I guess the challenge is accommodating that within a really structured and repetitive grid, standardized structure and grid. Just showing those typologies on the upper levels. and the top floor, the three bedrooms. And just showing that the scheme in its context. I guess the main thing to see here is the generous setbacks from all sides. So whilst we are being quite a tall and proud 3-story building, it's an important part of the scheme to have a lot of open space around, just to create a generous enough space for greenery to grow, to be a buffer to neighbouring developments. And for the landscape, on the scheme we worked with open work, stage 2, and so I guess the landscape has been a lot about trying to make the open air driveway, which isn't under the building, but out in the open, sort of as usable friendly as possible, with lots of green planting and shade, and the basketball court, just to give it I guess more usability, and then the private gardens, obviously, sort of for the residents to create their own gardens. And then to the north, in that northeast corner, a small kind of productive garden that faces onto the street and catches the north sun. And then, as I mentioned, in between the two buildings, this really kind of ferny forest walk, we called it, which is sort of shade-loving plants and really lush passageway between the buildings. And I guess going a step further in terms of siting, we also looked at the possibility for this typology to work on 2 or 3 or 4 lots in different orientations, and just kind of proving the flexibility of such a basic linear module and the ability to reorientate. And this is just showing an example of east-west oriented site, so all of the volumes facing north away from the street. And then next page. And then as we developed it for the Braybrook competition, with the north to the street, and a rotated rear volume. So just showing those 2 key orientations. And sustainability was obviously would have been embedded in the siting of the design, just in the sort of prioritization of orienting towards the north to capture that solar gain. But we've also worked with Finding Infinity to develop and optimize a number of initiatives to reduce our energy, water, as well as our waste. And of course, the embodied energy through the use of timber. And we proposed and worked with different suppliers to develop sort of a cross-laminated timber, ground 1, level 2 structure, and lightweight on top. And this was just a study exploring, sort of showing the sort of net benefit of building with timber instead of concrete, and the reduction in embodied carbon.
And so, as well as the adaptation of that competition design for the planning scheme, we've also tended to deliver an adaptation of the design as a public housing project, which is being delivered by Homes Victoria. And we're currently sort of in planning process at the moment, getting that through. And the brief is, I guess, from the beginning, as a public housing project, it had a different brief and different constraints from the Department of Housing. So we instantly had to adapt our scheme. Some of the brief requirements were for 12 social housing units. They had a specific mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. we had to have 2 SDAs, so special disability apartments on the ground floor. And then critically as well, the department had as a requirement for no split level apartments. So just identifying the site, it's on Ballarat Road in Braybrook. And there's really a mix of kind of remnant weatherboards, some newer developments, sort of setback developments, mix of commercial buildings, and then the sort of predominant emerging typology of the townhouse subdivision. So just capturing that mix of street interfaces that we see along Ballarat Road with the site identified in red. And then I guess as we've gone through the planning process, we've really come to a head with that kind of key question of how do you reconcile medium density development within existing suburbs. And we've had a look at sort of benchmarks of the status quo of how kind of status quo developments get through, and they often kind of result in a stepped back form that complies with res code, that sort of maximizes the yield on the site with little space for kind of deep soil zones and potentially compromised interiors, but then also like over-reliant on kind of formal gestures to sort of tie the composition together. So then we've looked at other more enduring examples from last century, which have a more simple form that would be easier to detail and perform better thermally, but then also with larger setbacks, using the landscape to create a buffer rather than a sort of a step back gesture. So looking at the ground floor plan, I guess the key adaptations are we've created we've kept a mezzanine entry lobby that takes residents through a pedestrian route through to the centre of the building, where we've got a garden as per our competition scheme, with a lightweight stair that takes residents up the building. And there's 2 special disability residents on the ground floor facing the street, with 3-bedroom sort of stack of apartments in the rear volume. And a mix of 1-bedrooms, 3-bedroom. And a really maximised sort of northern frontage with balconies and terraces on the upper level. And this is a scheme as it's currently looking. So I guess one of the kind of key planning conversations that we've been having is that it's okay, especially on a road like Ballarat Road, which is in such transition, to present as a 3-story building on its ends and just rely on setbacks with trees as a buffer. And this will hopefully set a good precedent for how development along this street will happen in the future. And on the east, we're providing windows with shading shutters, and then you get a view into that garden with canopy trees growing between the 2 volumes. and then a view from the car park, which again, we've been working with open work and been looking at strategies through the ground treatments to kind of descale the car park and give opportunities for sort of parasitic planting to grow around its edges. Another view looking back through the entry. And we've really made a conscious decision to try and keep all of the circulation open air, so that I guess the public space bleeds through the building. That all-important view from the rear street as well, just showing this integration and sort of descaling of dormer windows through that setback roof at the rear. That's the view through the entry. Also, part of open works design is arbor that sort of balances the privacy from also the inside looking out, and also demarcates the entrance through. Thank you.
Thanks. That brings it to an end. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. An amazing project. We said we would have time for 1 or 2 questions, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask if you can look back now to competition phase, and I would like to hear your thoughts on the competition brief. In a sense, it feels like you were very thorough about it, and that it helped a lot how you developed your project. But it would be great to hear from your side what you think about it.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think the competition brief was so dense and so full of requirements, it almost seemed overwhelming in the beginning. But I think that structure almost did kind of help us work out like the core building block, and so it was quite helpful in that way. In terms of the brief overall, I think we do remember having like discussions early days about the decision for this future homes development to be only apartments and sort of not townhouses. But I think as we've progressed through the competition and been really working on the viability of a development in this context, it's been interesting to learn like really just how important it is for the amalgamated lots to be apartments and to be quite dense apartments, just to make them affordable. Yeah.
Okay. A follow-up on that, a question about design guidelines, and how do you see them? Are they helpful in relation to design response? And in your own work, are you able to harvest the knowledge that is embedded there with the best intention to help designers? And how do you evaluate that against the specific design response for each individual site?
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting process as we've been developing our competition scheme on to be sort of a more viable guideline for future development. I guess it's been interesting that we've had to really design in a way which was optimized to a very specific set of circumstances. But yeah, I think the development of guidelines that show how they can be adapted will hopefully leave some flexibility that the sort of initial sort of principles can kind of unlock.
Okay. Okay, and then the very final one, the model that you developed. I know it's limited by planning in a certain extent, but do you feel it could go higher? Do you feel that the same topology could be used to add another? Because the projects that we've selected and we've spoken to would often go up to 6 floors as sort of mid-rise development. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about increasing the height of the model.
Definitely. I mean, it has been designed to such a, I guess, a rigid sort of grid and spatial layout, so it'd be very easy to stack vertically. And I could imagine that external circulation working well, like probably 6 meters might be the limit. I don't know. But certainly, yeah.
Because one of the main qualities that you put forward is the relationship to private outdoor space and direct access from it. So I think that that is real quality and something that you wouldn't want to lose. But once when you start increasing the height, you have new challenges. But it could be an interesting design.
Yeah, we definitely feel like we've optimized the design for the 3-story.
3-story, yeah, that's true. It's very.
Yeah, there's certainly aspects of it that we could keep adapting and changing from that basic building block. Definitely.
I suppose there's not an end to it. You always have to keep on working and adapting the model according to specific requirements.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your presentation and for amazing work that you've shared with us. And I'd like to conclude here, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to talk.